Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a great lunch, got some fresh air, some sunshine. The next 60 minutes or so, we want to talk about work. And we do this because work is, at least for most of us, much more than earning money. It gives us our identity. For some of us, work is even meaningful or purposeful. And work definitely gives us status in society. But work also underpins economic growth, and we talked about that we need this more. It gives us collective resilience as a society, and also work signals societal progress. How we work, how we want to work, how we experience work has massively changed after COVID. And there are multiple things going on. AI and technology is entering the work much more. We have questions if this is actually increasing our productivity or might it lead to job displacement. We have calls for shorter work weeks, more work-life balance, and there are also rising mental health issues in the workplace. Some are caused by work, but all of them affect how we can work and how able we are to work. So we want to explore in this panel how good work in the future can look like. And by this we mean good work for individuals, businesses, and society as a whole. To explore this, I have a great panel with me. So I'll start with Sarah O'Connor. She is an associate editor at the Financial Times, where she writes about work, technology, and the economy. Now we have Professor Brandon Burchell, who's a professor of the social science here at the University of Cambridge. And next to me, Kate Bell. She is the Assistant General Secretary at the Trade Union Congress. With this, I would like to start with you, Brandon, because most of you who already know you, might know you from your work with the 4-day week trials in the UK. So testing a shorter working week. So maybe just start explaining to us, what is the 4-day week, what does it mean, and what kind of insights do you have for productivity and well-being?
Thank you. Well, just to put it into a wider context, I've been interested most of my career in people's well-being and as that interacts with the world of work. And continuing the theme from this morning, lots of the problems that I've been looking at over those decades, I would class as wicked problems. Dealing with inequality from the labour market, dealing with people with bad jobs, zero-hour contract jobs, jobs where they don't feel safe, don't feel respected, don't feel they've got meaning through their work, and the people who are excluded from work, the unemployed and the people now who are excluded for other reasons through disability or long-term illness. And for a long time, I thought people working long hours was, again, one of those wicked problems. We had economists telling us 100 years ago that we should be working 15 hours a week by now. And yet, certainly in the last 30 years, the UK and many other advanced countries in the world, we'd seen no advance towards reduced working hours. We had the productivity that would allow us to do that, but we weren't doing it. It became clear that it needed more than those new technologies, labour-saving technologies, to reduce work. But then suddenly, and largely I think because of the pandemic and the way that it broadened our imaginations, suddenly we've got a lot of organisations and individuals where the whole organisation, not individuals choosing to work shorter hours, but whole organisations, or sometimes whole countries, are now thinking about reducing the working week. And in particular, there's one model that we've got a lot of data on. It seems very successful. It's called the 100-80-100 model. 100% productivity, so we're not talking about people doing less at work. We're doing whatever you're trying to do at work, however you measure that, doing the same amount, but in 80% of the hours, a clear reduction in hours. Again, we're not talking about compressed hours. We're not talking about working 4 long days, but a genuine reduction in hours and no pay cuts. If you're still doing the amount of work, you still get the same amount of pay. And we've done this more so in the UK than other countries, but we've got probably about 10 countries around the world that have been experimenting with this model. In all of those situations, it's been successful. So now we have data from hundreds of companies and thousands of individuals. And I think it's the way forward. I think again, sometimes you work away on wicked problems for a long time, and it can be a bit dispiriting. And then suddenly you see a way forward. You see a way that we really can have a much better labour market, and it's achievable. It's EU are just starting. I've been working this week on, of course, the UK were excluded from it, but the rest of the EU have got a big trial coming up in lots of member states on the 4-day week. Yeah, I think it's the way forward. I think once people have had a 3-day weekend, they don't want to go back. It really does improve people's working lives massively. I talk to so many people in these studies who are now so happy with their working lives under this new model.
Okay. So the 4-day week and how you described it is a bit based on the principle that what is good for a worker can also be good for businesses?
This is coming from businesses, absolutely, which is a surprise because in the past we've seen when we've had historically, going back to the 19th century, big advances in reduced working hours. It's often come from trade unions. They were seen as the big champions there, and sometimes it comes from government regulation, as we've seen maybe the European Working Time Directive. In this case, it's coming from the business community, which who would have foreseen that?
What is your opinion on that coming from a trade union perspective? Is that true what Brendan is saying, or are we sometimes ignoring the fact that what is good for the individual is not always good for the bottom line of a company?
Well, we take a bit of credit for the 4-day week. We had a big push on it when the Trade Union Congress had our 150th anniversary in 2017, and we said our big call at that point was we think we can get to a 4-day week this century, which some people at the time said that's wildly ambitious, and some people said, come on guys, go a bit faster please. And we've always talked about it coming from collective bargaining, so coming from workers demanding it. And I think you have seen that, in some organisations across the country. I mean, I think there are real win-wins in that kind of higher productivity work model, and there are often real win-wins for workers and business in making work better. We've got this big employment bill going through Parliament at the moment. That should be raising the floor of employment rights, and it should be also strengthening our collective rights, so strengthening the ability to organise in a trade union and for people to raise their voices collectively. But I think in the short term, these don't always look like win-wins for business and workers. Basically, we know that model of stronger employment rights normally does go hand in hand with higher productivity over the long term. But in the short term, often it means businesses do have to rethink the way they're organising work. It might mean lower shareholder returns for a period, as some of those returns are redistributed into the pockets of workers. But over the long term, what we know is that higher standards model can be a race to the top, a higher productivity model that does benefit the bottom line as well as workers themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know, Sarah, that you sometimes have quite critical perspectives on these issues and write about them in your article. So I'm wondering, can all work actually be meaningful for people? Or are we ignoring the fact that some jobs just remain tough, remain unrewarding, also in the future?
I will answer that question in a minute. I thought I'd just chip in quickly on the 4-day week stuff, which I think is really interesting. And you might want to push back on this, but my sense is that this idea of 100% of productivity in 80% of hours, I mean, wow, amazing, a 20% productivity gain, extraordinary. You might say, if companies were capable of doing that, why haven't they done it already? Why would they leave that on the table? And I think the model kind of works for a lot of white collar work. I sometimes think of, when you go on holiday and you've got a suitcase, no matter how big or small the suitcase is, you fill it, right? And I often think that white collar work is like that. It expands to fill the space available. And so I can well believe that in a lot of jobs, including mine actually, I work a 4-day week at the minute and I still manage to get everything done that I need to do because I just kind of really focus on it and I don't take as many coffee breaks and all the rest of it. So I think that works for a proportion of the economy, but I think we need to remember that there are lots of people who work in jobs that are already really optimized for productivity. If you work in a Jaguar Land Rover factory or in an Amazon warehouse alongside robots, your employer has already figured out how to extract as much productivity as they can per hour, and I don't see how, for those workers, you would be able to simply say, you're going to do 100% of your productivity, but in 4 days instead of 5. And so I think, I think that's a kind of question that the people pushing for a 4-day week need to answer. Although I love the idea of it, so that's a kind of a friendly criticism, not a hostile one. And then to your question on can all work be meaningful, I think you have to kind of first of all define what meaningful is and what. So I spend a lot of time sort of on the ground with my notebook interviewing people from all walks of life, doing all kinds of jobs. And one of the things that struck me is that people find meaning in all kinds of different ways. And what is meaningful for one person might not be meaningful for another. I remember once I asked the question on Twitter, not very scientific, sorry to the academics in the room, please tell me the story of like the best job you ever had, the job that you loved. And the sheer kind of variety of responses that came back to me, there was someone who'd worked in a kind of a warehouse where they just moved boxes around all day, but what he loved about it was the friends that he made there, and they just had a lot of fun. There was someone who worked in a fast food restaurant, and they just loved the pace of it and the intensity and the fact that they were just, churning it out, and they were like a well-oiled machine. There was someone who loved the fact that they could just close the door on their job at the end of the day and walk away, and it didn't permeate at all into their private life. And there was someone else who had the opposite feeling, that he was a foreign correspondent, and he said what he loved was the way that the kind of walls of the job and real life kind of dissolved away, and everything was in some way meaningful and part of his work. And I say that in order to say that it's very hard to say what meaningful is. And therefore, I think it's not at all naive to think that all work can be meaningful, but I think it is naive to think you can legislate for it. I don't think we can come up with a definition of meaningful that works for everyone and then somehow try and build that into legislation. I don't think you can come up with a list of what a meaningful job is. Or to be honest, even, I know this is maybe sort of slightly provocative in a talk that is about good work, but I'm not sure you can even define what a good job is, really, because what is good for one person is not good for someone else. And even for one person at different stages of their lives, I had a job when I was younger at the FT where I was working really long hours, churning out lots and lots of articles. I might be asked to hop on a plane and go to Iceland at short notice because there was a banking crisis. This is when you're in your 20s, this is phenomenal stuff. This is a perfect job. Now I have a 5-year-old, that is not the perfect job for me. That would be a terrible job for me. Now I have a much more sedate job where I know exactly what I have to do and when I have to do it. And so I think, trying to define what a good job is and then somehow build that into legislation, I think is probably not the way to do it. But what I would say is we can all agree on what a bad job is, or what combination of things are bad, or make what should be good jobs turn bad, because there are plenty of people who have jobs they love and then something changes and it saps the enjoyment from that job. And so I think that's the way that we should think about this, is what are the things that make jobs bad or turn good jobs bad, and let's try and stop those things happening.
I know Kate probably wants to comment on that.
Yeah, but it was partly on that, but I was just thinking about one of the strange things about the debate about work at the moment is, on the one hand, we're saying it's not possible to optimise productivity for a 4-day week. On the other hand, every day there's a new headline which says all jobs will disappear because of the vast productivity benefits of AI, basically. So the way we've always tried to pitch this conversation about kind of working time is who benefits from those productivity benefits? When we get them, how do we distribute them so that the Amazon worker can work a 4-day week, so that the professor can work a 4-day week, and how do we share them out? And I think that's what we've been trying to think about to kind of bring those debates together, where on the one hand you've got, these people just can't do that. It's impossible to organise these tasks differently. And on the other, all these tasks will disappear. I mean, just one other thing I was going to say about Sarah's point about can you legislate for all jobs to be meaningful? I agree you can't, but you can legislate for basic conditions without which it's very difficult to find meaning in your work. So if you don't know when you're going to be working, if you don't know if you're allowed to talk about your pay with your colleagues, for example, if you're not treated with respect at work, if you're not safe at work, if you never get the opportunity to learn, it's very difficult for you to find meaning in your work. And those are things we can measure, we can legislate for, and we can give the people the power in their workplaces to stand up and ask for themselves.
Yeah,
just to back you up entirely. I mean, this is what I do a lot of my time, is measuring job quality across Europe, and lots of those things, almost all of them, I can measure them quite well. And I think we've got a lot more in common as people than we have different. Okay, some people want to work with babies, some people want to work with horses. But putting that aside, none of us want to be bullied at work. None of us want to finish a day when you've got backache or eye strain. None of us want to be under constant time pressure. There's a lot of things, and we can measure those. We know across Europe, for instance, that Scandinavian countries do very well in this way. The UK does actually really quite well. France does really quite badly. We know these things. Yeah, I agree with you on meaningfulness work. That's escapes. We can measure it, but trying to think of what policies would drive those improvements, that's difficult. And I think there are some jobs where it is going to be difficult to achieve that. I think people in this room probably most of us have got jobs where we find a lot of meaning in our work, but that's not true for everyone. And that's why I think for those people who don't find creativity or enjoyment in their work, having a 3-day weekend so they can use that time for all those other things that we want to achieve as human beings is so important.
Do you have an example of in which context the 4-day week also works that is not a traditional office job?
Thank you. I have lots of examples, yeah. If you live in Cambridge, your bins are being emptied by people who now work a 4-day week. We've got examples in retail. We've got examples in manufacture. Yeah, we're overrepresented. We are overrepresented in white-collar jobs, that's true, but by no means. And again, the success rate tends to be probably over 90%, well over 90% in white-collar jobs. It's a bit lower. It's only 80 or 70% in these trials in some other sectors. But still, the vast majority are successful. I think it's true. We're not going to, through this mainly employer-led initiatives, which often start to take place in very small organisations where people don't have the benefits of trade union membership. That's going to go so far, I think. And who knows how, one thing that social scientists are very bad at predicting is how change is going to come about. But I think we can go so far, we're normalising and people accepting and people are wanting a 4-day week. That's become very clear, and that's changed enormously since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, when I was doing this sort of work, people were saying I was a fantasist looking at utopian situations. Why don't I look at real-world situations? Nobody says that anymore. I think we've got the reality, the 4-day week coming. But it's not all going to be done on this win-win situation. There are going to be people on zero-hour contracts and in some of the more abusive work situations where it's going to have to come about either by legislation or because employers are forced to do it, because otherwise nobody's going to go and work there. We know one of the massive advantages of employers that go to a 4-day week, and often this is what drives it, is because they couldn't recruit before. This is why South Cambridgeshire District Council, one of the main reasons, they just couldn't recruit. As soon as they went to a 4-day week, people were queuing up for jobs at South Cambridge District Council. So the market can work to some extent. But yeah, ultimately we're going to need collective bargaining and we're going to need legislation for it to roll out over the country and for it not to be yet another source of inequality.
Yes, please, Sarah.
I was just going to chip in with an example to support what Kate was saying, that, this idea that as technology creates the opportunity to do more with fewer hours, there are examples of unions kind of managing to turn that to their advantage. So like IG Metall in Germany, representing the steel workers there, this past year, in their kind of big collective negotiations, so steel has become much more productive. Partly it's about changing from like the old way of making steel to a new way, including using arc furnaces, which are kind of just need fewer workers, right? And so rather than accepting that there will just be fewer steel workers and that there'll be big job losses, the union pushed for a transition to a 4-day week for those steel workers, so that as the amount of work that is required reduces, you kind of spread it out among everyone so that everyone benefits from more leisure rather than having some people working as hard as before and other people becoming unemployed. And they didn't get everything that they wanted for, but I think they got down to, Kate probably knows, it was like 4.5 maybe, or 4.3 days per week. So, there are definitely examples of that happening. And yeah, those two things definitely can go hand in hand.
And the Communication Workers Union in the UK has bargained on working time and reduced the length of the working week. So it hasn't always been, there's something kind of beautifully neat about the 4-day week. We can all understand it, although questions about, is everyone having the same, is it a Monday? Is it a Friday? But, you know, service sector workers often don't get to be off on a Saturday or Sunday right now, so there's something to think about there. But reductions in working time or an additional holiday day, we've long argued for an extra bank holiday, for example. That would be one step in a reduction in overall working time, have always been part of the trade union agenda, and you do see real gains there.
Yeah, but based on this, if we are thinking about high productive industries that might require fewer workers in the future, just the Rheinmetall examples, are we sometimes misleading ourselves by promising everyone a good job in the future or a better job? Or do we actually need to talk about more seriously about the fact that there might be massive job displacement?
I try not to be too sceptical about the massive job displacement, but I am pretty sceptical about it, basically. And I keep being in conversations. I just overheard on the train someone here saying, I've been told that AI could write my PhD in a month, basically, slightly resentfully. So maybe this kind of big technological uplift we've been told about for at least a decade or so, basically. You know, first we were going to have massive job displacement because of automation. Now we're going to have massive job displacement because of AI. Maybe it is accelerating, maybe it's speeding up, but we're not really seeing that anywhere yet, basically. So my attempt to kind of combine my skepticism with, I don't know about this, you know, there may be kind of huge leaps forward in knowledge, is to think, well, if we are going to have a faster pace of job change, what do we need to have in place in order to make sure that's done fairly? And again, it's some of the basics, basically. It's the right to get a share of those productivity gains if it's in your own company. It's access to good quality training so that you know that you might be able to take advantage of some of those skills. And it's also knowing that there's not only a few places in the economy where there are good paid, well-paid jobs with decent terms and conditions. And if you lose one of those, I'm afraid, well, the rest of the jobs aren't going to be any good. And I think sometimes the kind of fear of change, particularly in the UK, is because we have some jobs which are designated as, yeah, that's a decent job, it's got good terms and conditions, you get a level of respect, maybe you've got a voice at work. And once you're out of there, everything else risks that kind of 0 hours contract, the Amazon warehouse, the kind of high intensity work that's involved there. Whereas if we had a kind of basic floor where we thought, well, okay, I might have to change my job, but my new job is probably also going to have a decent floor of terms and conditions, we might be less anxious about that change, whatever pace it happens at.
The example you just gave with the overheard conversation around ChatGPT and writing a PhD, I'm wondering, are we sometimes overvaluing the short-term efficiency gains that we get from AI and technology and ignore the fact how using AI, for example, with this PhD example, might impact our long-term ability to develop skills, to learn, to keep our critical thinking. I know, Sarah, I think you wrote an article around this.
Yeah, I've done a few articles on this topic now. I mean, the answer is obviously it's very, very early days. I mean, no one really knows. And as Kate says, we're not, with the exception of a few professions, like I was interviewing this morning a translator, that profession is absolutely seeing huge disruption and job loss at the moment. But if, you know, they're sort of on the kind of leading edge of this. For most of us, I think it's kind of too early to say. But this question around, like, setting aside, will jobs disappear or not, how will the use of AI in our work sort of change the way that we think or the way that we acquire knowledge and mastery and that sort of thing, I think is really important. And, you know, universities are one place, I think, that are starting to think about this most carefully. I'm sure, like, a lot of the people in this room have thought about it a lot. So, yeah, I wrote a piece not long ago about I had this sort of naive idea in my head that, okay, you know, lots of surveys have come out to say that students now have kind of hugely adopted ChatGPT and other LLMs in order to help them with their essays and so forth, and, you know, often even in assessments where they're able to. And my naive thought was, well, fine, you know, why not just give the student a task where you say, look, I've asked ChatGPT to answer this essay question. This is what they've done. You need to do something better. Because in a way, that's That's how they're going to be able to make money in the job market, is if they can add value beyond what the machine can do. I thought it was a kind of very neat, tidy solution, and that would all be fine. And then I started talking to academics who actually, work in universities, and almost all of them said, no, it's a terrible idea. And some of them had tried it. Some of them had the same thought as me and had tried it with their classes. And basically what they found was the students, once they were given, particularly undergraduates, once they were given output from ChatGPT or whichever AI system it was, they kind of couldn't really look too much beyond it. And so all they did was sort of cosmetic changes. They didn't really engage with the structure of the argument. They didn't really do anything substantial. And we're starting to see studies now done of the way people engage with this stuff, that it, in a way, I think it sort of narrows your creativity and your kind of capacity to think deeply. And so what these academics were telling me was that actually they think that, yes, these will be useful tools for people later on in their careers, but that doesn't mean that introducing them at the start might be quite dangerous. They're quite a dangerous shortcut, which might mean that you don't acquire the kind of ability to think critically, to structure an argument, to know things, that you might kind of pass off a kind of superficial veneer of knowledge without really being able to use the tools judiciously. And I think there's a very clear danger there that you end up massively over-reliant on them and not able to use them in a sort of sensible way. And even Microsoft, which obviously is one of the companies which is sort of desperately trying to push these tools on all of us in our work, they did a study where they kind of looked at real-world examples of people using ChatGPT-style tools in their work, and they concluded that they were reducing critical thinking and encouraging an over-reliance on AI. So,
yeah, no, that's good insight. I wanted to come back to you, Brendan, for a second, because we talked about a lot now about the shorter weeks and the benefit it has. Does your research tell us anything what people do with their extra time? Is it like benefiting society, or are we just spending more time, I don't know, watching TV? Or
We're starting to see, a lot of the research that I and my colleagues do is looking at what people do on that extra day off, how their weekends are different, and that tells us a lot about, for instance, the environmental impact of this. And surprise, surprise, it's gendered. More women spend more time doing domestic work on that day off than men. Of course, what we don't have yet is couples where they're both working 4-day weeks. That's still very rare. In all our trials, it's almost always one person having the reduced work. Yeah, people do more of lots of things. People watch Netflix more. They don't go to church more. We've got lots of that fine detail. And very often it's more the qualitative. People say that the things that they're doing now, because they have more time to do them, particularly parents with young children, say that their weekends were just so busy getting everybody washed and homework done and ready to go back to school on Monday. Having that extra day means they can do things in a leisurely, and cooking at leisure can be enjoyable. Cooking because you've got to cook after a long day's work isn't leisurely. So it qualitatively really changes what people do. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people talk about extra caring responsibilities, spending more time with their kids, spending more time for elder care. There's all sorts of benefits that people get from it. And learning new skills. I mean, it's not all leisure in a narrow sense.
Yeah. Before we move to the second part of the discussion, where you can ask questions to the panel, I need to ask Kate, what are your thoughts on the new employment rights bill? Because it strengthens, I think, quite a lot the position of unions. There's a lot around gig work, dismissals. Is there anything you're missing, or you're quite happy with what they put together?
I think we're really happy that it's happening. It's been a really, really long time since we've had a move forward in employment rights and in trade union rights, and that feels really big, and it contains a lot of things we've been campaigning for a really long time. So a ban on 0 hours contracts, an end to fire and rehire, decent sick pay from day one, better maternity and paternity rights, more rights for trade unions to access workplaces, to be able to tell people about the ability to join a trade union and to get the right to bargain with their employer. So we think it's a huge step forward, but we are the trade union movement. We always want more for workers. It hasn't yet thought about how you might manage and regulate IAI in the workplace, and we have actually written a whole piece of legislation in draft form to hand over to the government. We think they could adopt. The government said it's going to act on employment status, so we have 3 types of where you could be a worker in the UK. You can be self-employed, you can be employed, and then you can be a worker, which gives you some of the rights of somebody who's employed, but not all of them. We think there's a real need to make a change to that. And then the government's gone a little step in towards more sectoral forms of bargaining, so where you get the right to bargain as a trade union across a whole industry or sector. We're going to have that in social care. We think they could have gone a little bit further. So definitely like a really, really important step forward, and it's still going through the Lords, so it's not there yet, but there'll always be more to do.
Yeah. Any thoughts from you on the new employment rights bill?
No, great stuff. We're going in the right direction. Maybe not at the speed we want to, but going in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's hard to disagree with any of the things that are in it. I think it's slightly unfortunate that it's coincided with a moment where the government's also raising employers' taxes, because it means that for employers, they're suddenly facing a big hike in the minimum wage, big kind of uncertain set of new rights to get their heads around, and a big increase in national insurance contributions. And I don't want to be the kind of gloomy one, but the danger is that it's quite easy in this country, because we're not very good at enforcing the laws that we already have. It's quite easy to basically kind of find ways of reallocating workers, particularly lower paid workers, into a sort of bogus self-employment category, whereby suddenly you don't have any of these obligations anymore. And we're already starting to see that now in retail, for example. We're starting to see apps crop up where you can be a kind of freelance self-employed person who works in a shop, and you wear the uniform of the shop, but you're classed as freelance. Those sorts of things probably wouldn't pass muster if and when they came to employment tribunal. But as Kate well knows, the employment tribunal system is absolutely clogged. It might take 3 or 4 years to even get your case heard, and then there'll be appeals. So, the sort of danger is that in trying very hard to kind of improve the lot of low-paid workers, unless you kind of really make sure that you're keeping an eye on the enforcement side of it, it might be a bit like squeezing a balloon, and employers that are under a lot of pressure, or who maybe don't have good intentions, might find ways of getting around it.
Yeah, great. Good. I would say we can start taking questions from the audience. Who has any questions? Yes, please, here in the front.
Thank you. Anna Vinyals from the Leverhulme Trust. Thanks for a fascinating session. I had a question for you, Brendan, and I'm sure that we'll all do more than Netflix and domestic duties if we had an extra day, or I'm hoping anyway. I was interested in whether you know how they have compressed the work whilst not losing the productivity. That was question number 1. Question number 2 is, what does this mean for the public sector? One thing that struck me during the pandemic was, for those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to work from home, the experience was entirely different. And after the pandemic, I think that division between those who can work from home and those who can't has sort of actually widened the gap in the quality of job. And I wonder whether there's a risk with this approach that you might do the same thing.
Okay, very good question. And Sarah asked me this too, how did they manage to bring about this massive increase in productivity? We normally know, economists talk about a 2 or 3% increase of productivity as difficult to achieve. How do you get 20 or 25% increase? I think it takes creativity, it takes people to think carefully about what they're doing. I think the single biggest thing that's different about the 4-day week compared to other restructuring or exercises that companies are often going through to trying to achieve that increased productivity is, in many other cases, the employees themselves know that if the restructuring works, it's not going to make their life better. It's going to help the shareholders, it's going to help somebody else, and they will get worse jobs coming out of it, or maybe even redundancies. In this case, everybody knows that if they can make it work, everybody gets Friday off or Monday off or a shorter working week. And that is a massive incentive, and I think it's largely to do with that incentive. And suddenly, people have never really thought about productivity in their in their working lives. They've done their jobs the way that other people do them and the way that people did them before. Now, when you get everybody thinking about how can we do it better, how can we meet better, have shorter meetings, smaller meetings, how can we use communication tools better, cut out procrastination, everyone's thinking along those lines collectively, and that's how. And I know it sounds too good to be true. I mean, in South Cambridgeshire District Council, they have probably the better measures of their performance than any of the other organisations we've looked at during the 4-day week. They have 24 key performance indicators. Nina knows this, she's been involved in this as well previously. And of those 24 indicators, and they've got a long time series, we could see what happened over the last 6 years, so before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and then during their 4-day week. And roughly speaking, about half of those stayed about the same, and half of them improved. They were actually fixing problems faster during the 4-day week than they were before. And there were lots of other reasons for this. They weren't having to employ lots of agency staff because they couldn't recruit properly. They weren't having to pay big incentives to recruit where they could. There were all sorts of reasons that it worked. So, when I first heard of this idea that you could... And just to say as well, one of the things that I've studied before is people working under constant time pressure. And I know that is very bad for your health. And so we measure that. And there is a very small increase in that, but it is a very small one. It's not because people are now rushing around desperate to get the work done. I think it's that collective thinking about how could we do it better, which hasn't happened before. I know since I've been doing this work, I now look at the university here and see how inefficient it is and how I think we could easily, have shorter working weeks if we got rid of some of the massive inefficiencies and duplications and long meetings. So it's that different mindset that things about. And you ask about hybrid working as well. I don't consider myself an expert. It's obviously a massive issue, and for some people it's made their working life so much better. For other employers and individuals, it's been very difficult for them. I think we're yet to see how this plays out. And of course, sometimes it does overlap into people having shorter working weeks. And one of the surprising findings we're getting now, I hadn't expected this, when we ask people how much they want to reduce their working hours, it hasn't, if anything, it might have gone up slightly. People aren't so desperate to reduce their hours now as they were 5 years ago. And I think that's because of hybrid working. People are much able to better cope with slightly longer hours if they've got that flexibility around homework. I think we're still struggling to really understand fully the implications of having hybrid working as part of an ongoing, something that's here to stay in our labour markets.
Can I just come in? Sorry for ask a question myself, but is there a risk that if the 4-day week becomes a reality in a couple of years, becomes mainstream implemented, then in 10, 20 years, there are calls for a 3-day week and then for a 2-day week?
Do you know, if that did come about, if in 10 years' time, and I think it's a very high possibility it will, if in 10 years' time we're all working a 4-day week, I will be so happy. I don't care what happens after that. If they start demanding a 3-day week. I mean, Bill Gates actually this week came out and he said his prediction, Bill Gates, I think he knows a little bit about these things, is that in 10 years' time we'll be working 2 days a week. I mean, as I said, I think it takes more than the technology to do that. It takes a political will to do that. But yeah, let's just get to the 4-day week first and then see what happens next.
Okay.
Yeah.
And other question there?
Could I ask another version of that same question, which is really thinking about operational roles rather than white-collar roles or academic roles? So my son's a nurse, for example. If he worked fewer hours, I'm not sure what would happen to the patients. So I think it's that category of job where I don't really understand how you can so easily get the gain.
Yeah, maybe that's...
Okay, shall I start?
Start.
Yeah, no, very good. And a question I'm asked very often. Again, I'm having lots of discussions about the NHS now. We know the NHS is well overripe for some really fundamental changes because it's got a lot of, again, you could call wicked problems in sorting that organisation out. We've got lots of examples of people doing that sort of frontline work where they've managed to reduce to a 4-day week and still working very efficiently. For instance, maybe a good example is in Portugal. We had a nursery school and the staff in the school went to 4-day week. The kids were still there 5 days a week and it still works. They did recruit one extra person, but this was quite a large school. The reason, there were lots of reasons they brought it about. One was there's very high rates of sick sickness absence in lots of those jobs. And then they were managing, not only did that reduce dramatically, but also people would cover for each other if somebody was off on sick leave. They just, again, thinking about reorganising what they did, how they could better cope. Again, because of that sick leave, they were having to overstaff because they knew on any one day, but they wouldn't know where it happened. People weren't going to come in. Working with young children, you pick up all the bugs. It's not, I don't think it's so much stress-related, but just the biological realities working in those environments. So in so many of the organisations, when we go in first and we talk about the 4-day week, the initial reaction is, it sounds like a good idea, but it could never work here because we're all working so hard and we've got so much work to do and so on. And in almost all those organisations, we get it to work. So I think, again, if we had a much better, I mean, when you look at the NHS, this is I'm not talking as an expert here, but I do talk to lots of employees in the NHS. Some of the time we know that they are really overworked in the NHS. And other times, a whole, say, operating unit or ward, there's hardly anything going on because of something in the system that hasn't worked. And I think if we could get those efficiency gains in nursing, for instance, I think it could more than offset the reduction in hours. And would be able to recruit. Again, we're having real problems recruiting. We know there are lots of people out there who are well qualified to do nursing and those things. These people have taken early retirement or out of the labour market for other reasons because they just don't want those stressed, long hours jobs. So I think we know, and the government recognises, that all those people economically inactive, getting them back into the labour market, not only would make their lives better, and I think we have very good data for that, but they'll start paying tax, which would help us as well. And again, part of attracting those people back into the labour market, I think making more attractive jobs, going back to what we were talking about job quality earlier, and I think those reduced hours is a very big part of that.
Kate, you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think it's definitely possible to imagine work being organised differently in the public sector. Hopefully your son doesn't work a 7-day week, so we're prepared to pay for enough people to cover for him to work a 5-day week. The question is, are we prepared to pay for there to be enough people to make sure there's safe staffing levels for him to work a 4-day week? And there's a number of ways we might achieve that. So we might get huge improvements in productivity in public services through the use of AI. And I think that's something the Bennett Institute are looking at, is the use of AI in public services. And there might be huge efficiencies to be made, which meant we could send more resources to the front line and we could organise work differently. Or we could say, we think the quality of work in this sector is so important to retention of staff, to recruitment of staff, that we're prepared to put more money into it. So, we're going to put up our taxes and we're going to fund the NHS better. So I don't think the issue is one of, is it possible to organise work differently? It's how much a resource are we prepared to put into actually doing that? That's the fundamental question when it comes to public services and shorter working weeks.
Great. Happy to take another question. The lady here in the middle. No, up. Yeah, you. Okay, I'm not good at pointing there. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much. I like the idea of a 4-day work week, but I'm also a bit critical because I think if you are allowing people to earn for 4 days and then spend for 3 days, it looks like we are disturbing the system that we have, because as you remember, during pandemic, when people could work flexibly but not having more leisure, technically, they fled London because they started to not like their flats being small. They started to not eat at Pret because they thought they can cook. So the businesses around started to collapse just with flexibility. And then you give people 3 days. Now they have more time to travel, but the income isn't increasing. So now they are freer, but they are not happier. And then you're saying they can develop other skills, but they cost. So again, they have time, but they don't have money. And then, as the saying goes, idle mind is a devil's workshop. So now the people have lots of free time, and they start to be more revolutionary. Not
Perfect.
So all I'm saying is that we are, of course, we think of this as making people happy ultimately, but the system is so ingrained in us, in the society, that I think in the short run, it's going to be a total chaos. Thank you.
Who wants to take this question?
Let me start. Yeah, there's some things we have very good evidence for. We know that people are happier, they sleep better, they take more exercise, they exercise more often. When they exercise for longer. People enjoy. There's certainly 97%. There are, unfortunately, a small number of people who are, for whatever reason, happier or safer in their offices than they are at home, whether it's because of domestic violence or other issues. But about 97% of people who've done the 4-day week want to continue with it and would be prepared to forego a large pay rise even in order to continue with it. We know that. We know that, like I say, they enjoy their longer weekends, more time off. You raise an important point about the environmental impact, and some of my colleagues are making very exaggerated, wild claims, unfounded claims about the environmental impacts. And we know, I mean, lots of our CO2 emissions come from inside the world of work. And as you say, absolutely, it depends what they do on their time off. If they spend more time gardening on their 3-day weekends, then it would probably have large environmental benefits. If they're all flying off to Prague for weekend breaks, it's going to have the opposite effect. And we really don't have that data yet. And probably, and certainly our evidence suggests, it takes a long time for people to adjust to a new 3-day weekend. And so there's a lot of inertia in what we do. So I think we need to see in the longer term whether those benefits. But no, and again, all our evidence, I mean, looking to the future, and we've said you can't predict the future actually, but I think at least you can start to plan for it and think of scenarios. And there's one scenario, if there is going to be this reduction in the requirement for human labour, if that does come about, there's I think a dystopian nightmare scenario where large parts of the population are excluded from the labour market. And I think that for all sorts of reasons, apart from them becoming revolutionaries, would be a nightmare. Whereas the idea of us all working 4 days or 3 days or whatever, Bill Gates 2 days, I think that is a something moving rather towards quite an optimistic future. And I think those are the sorts of choices at least we ought to be starting to think about as we think what the world is going to be like in 10 years' time.
I need to come in here for a second because I'm just thinking, we're talking about these progressive changes and 4-day weeks, shorter working weeks. The reality currently is that some companies call their people back into the office and don't even allow flexible working anymore, right? So that feels like a step back. And these are huge employers who say 5 days back into the office, no hybrid working allowed anymore because we're concerned about productivity, we're concerned about competition, global uncertainties. So are we missing a bit in the conversation we are having, the reality that a lot of business leaders are facing? Sarah?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think in a way it's a sort of psychological thing. You know, you say that Bill Gates reckons everyone's going to go to a 2-day week. I bet he doesn't work a 2-day week. I bet he never has. You know, like people who get to the tops of these, people historically who have got to the tops of these big companies and indeed government have been workaholics by and large, and a lot of them sort of pride themselves on their capacity to work very hard. And you know, we've all read those articles about successful CEOs who get up at 4 a.m. and run for 10 miles before they have their green juice and stuff. And so I feel like there's probably just even if they can see the economic benefits, I wonder if that's the person you are and you think that your success has been built on this, there might be a sort of failure of imagination that actually this could work for other people, and that other people who might want this might not be lazy, but they might have other things in their life that matter as much or more to them than their jobs.
Yeah, Kate?
I just think it's really important to remember that stuff has changed before. So when we were doing our call for the 4-day week, I did some reading about what happened when we brought in the weekend. And there's these parliamentary debates from the 1950s when coal miners were allowed to have weekends. And you can read the debates in the House of Lords with people saying the whole country is going to come to a halt, we will have outbreaks of idleness, nothing will happen. And of course, a weekend is now basically thought of as standard. That can go in 2 directions, very hotly debated Sunday trading laws, basically. If you'd been in the UK 30 years ago, fewer people would have been working on a Sunday and we would have had an additional day of rest. We've moved back in the other direction there. But even, cultural things as well. Some of the culture that Sarah talks about means that, again, 30, 40 years ago, it would have been thought impossible that a woman could run one of those companies because of cultural assumptions about preferences, about work-family preferences. That hasn't changed nearly fast enough, but it has changed. And sometimes we kind of talk about these kind of trends in the world of work, like, we all make our living out of talking about trends in the world of work, but we talk about them as if they're kind of fixed or impersonal or just sort of handed down from somewhere else, as opposed to things that we actively shape, that we talk about, that are, influenced by personal culture, but also by legislation, by trade unions, by academics, and we can all shape them, and they have changed before and can change again.
Yeah, that makes sense. Happy to take a couple more questions in the front here.
Hi, Anthony Painter from UFI Trust. Thinking about productivity and work, to what extent do you think that investment is not being undertaken because there isn't a sufficient skills pool to draw on? And alongside that, how much investment do you think is taking place without co-investment in skills enabling the full utilisation of that technology? And if either of those questions is significant, what should we do about it?
Who wants to have an attempt? Yeah, okay. I think so. I've been trying to think about this question recently. So employer investment in training has massively declined over the last decade. I think it's gone down by 30%, and employers in the UK invest half the European average in skills, and yet constantly talk about skills shortages in the labour market. So there's one kind of answer which says, okay, well, something's happened and we've got to collectively force them to invest in skills, which is basically what I think. But I was made to think about this the other day when someone said, well, employers haven't invested in anything over the last decade. So they've stopped investing in capital, they've stopped investing in people, productivity has flatlined as a result. So, I think my basic thought is we need collective ways to encourage employers to invest in skills. I think Sarah's written about HGV drivers. We had a massive skills shortage because we'd had underinvestment for years. Now they're investing in some training and in improving paying conditions. But I think it is also interesting to think about, is the lack of investment in training part of employers' wider investment strike? And if so, do we need to address it in that way as well as thinking about the specific measures on skills?
I will read out one of the questions from the audience online. Recently, changes to the welfare and benefit system have been announced with the goal to encourage people to go back to work and cut costs for the welfare system. In a time where even those willing and able to work are facing difficulty finding a quality job, is the government's ambition too hard?
Yeah, I think it is quite ambitious to think that you can sort of take money off people and therefore they will suddenly discover a job that works for them in their neighbourhood. I mean, I think part of the issue is that a lot of people who have health problems, not everyone, but for a reasonably large number, they're kind of like, they're not fixed, right? Like they're kind of relapsing, remitting. Some days might be better than others, and some days you might feel fine, and other days you might really not feel fine. And there are a lot of jobs at the moment, particularly at the kind of lower paid end of the labour market, that just have no tolerance for that whatsoever, that expect you to be able to give 100% productivity for every hour that you're there. And so I think that is quite a difficult sell. And also sort of geographically, if you think about if you sort of mapped out where in the country are the local authorities that have the highest proportion of people who are not working due to ill health, they're places that also have a real dearth of jobs. And that is, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing, but it's a really difficult one to sort out. So, Blackpool is a absolutely classic example of a place that probably has one of the highest proportions of people out of work due to ill health. And the work there is, predominantly tourist stuff. So it's 0 hours contracts, it's seasonal, it's go in the summer, and then there's, a lot of those jobs disappear in the winter. And so figuring out how to think about the kind of the labour market side of this, as well as the sort of incentives on the benefit side, I think still needs a lot more work.
Yeah.
one of the, if I can, one of the studies that we did in South Cambridgeshire District Council, one of my colleagues was looking at the employees there that in particular had disabilities or medical problems or very unusual high caring demands. And there you could see the benefits of the 4-day week were just incredible for those people. And we know that lots of people who are out of the labour market, there is a component of that health issues in there. People often, they need just that extra day to look after themselves, to do their medical appointments, or to care for others. Made a huge difference. It really was incredibly heartening hearing about all the people who felt that they could work on a 4-day week but wouldn't have been able to work on a 5-day week. So I think if we are going to think about, and I do think it's an important issue for the government to think about how we do increase participation in the labour market, and if we're going to get away from previous government's approaches that are using sticks to do that, making life more difficult for people out of the labour market, and think about carrots, then I think improving job quality has enormous potential to do that.
Happy to take one or two more questions. The lady there.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Anne Bailey, and I'm from an organisation called Form the Future. And what we're trying to do is get young people into good work. And we take that view that good work is what is good for them. How do young people, say new starters, people early in their career, fit into this hyper-productive 4-day week economy? Is there enough slack in the system to enable them to get up to speed and to learn and grow? Just interested in your thoughts.
Thank you.
I mean, just one quick thought on that. Most companies, when they go through a transformation, there are teething problems, and it's the same with going from a 5-day week to a 4-day week, as it was going, as we said, going from a 6-day week to a 5-day week, which we did about 100 years ago. Other countries have done more recently. One of the typical teething problems that comes up is the lack of, you can have a reduction in mentoring, informal mentoring that goes on for young people who join the organisation. Again, this is also a problem to do with hybrid working. But like lots of these things, they're problems once you face up to them and are very alert to them, deal with them quickly. There are simple solutions to them. So again, South Cambs had to bring in a more explicit mentoring for young people and other people who joined the organisation. So I think, it's important to think about how people get socialised into organisations. But you be aware of it and you find solutions to these problems. They're not fundamental problems.
Great. Another question? And maybe I need, okay, one right here.
Thank you. If people are happier and healthier in their work, they should reasonably be able to work for longer. Therefore, could we use a 4-day week to address one of the great economic time bombs of our age and raise the state pension age as well?
With one of the question that really got me thinking about working time, and this is a question I was asking myself about 8 years ago, with everything else that someone tells you, if someone says something's good for you, the first question you should ask is, what's the minimum, what's the maximum dose? So if someone says sleep is good for you, cabbage is good for you, sunlight is good for you, all these things, you can have too little and you can have too much. And I think work is that. And so in my data suggests that the optimal amount of work is somewhere between 1 day a week and 5 days a week. But it depends what everyone else is doing. If everyone else is working 5 days a week and you work 4 or 3 days a week, you put yourself at a disadvantage. You'll become marginalised, you're on a lower income, you're not going to accrue the same pension, and you're going to really sabotage your promotion opportunities. And that's why it's so important that we reduce working time for the whole society, certainly for whole organisations at a time, and not individuals. But the idea of working a shorter working week, but then working longer into old age, I think that's a very attractive idea. I don't have data on it, and I want data on all these things before I start talking about it. But I think, deferring the pension, the retirement age, but people working longer, possibly in different jobs that suit them better at that point in life, I think is something we definitely should take seriously.
I once wrote in a piece that statistic that you mentioned from Keynes about, we should all be working a 50-hour week by now. Paul Johnson at the IFS got in touch to say that actually, in a way, Keynes was right. We do take that much leisure, but we've decided to lump it all at the end of our working lives. So we've got like a huge retirement where we're doing nothing, but then we're still working longer hours. And so, you know, there is something kind of intuitively appealing about this notion of like pacing yourself, right? Like just, you can do it for longer. But I also quite like the idea that, you know, there's a certain amount of leisure you're going to take in your life, but why not distribute it in different ways? You know, why not a number of sabbaticals every sort of 3 or 4 years at the point where you're starting to feel a bit burned out? You know, that we could be a lot more imaginative, but the kind of caveat to that is that the people that I think will struggle the most to embrace this wonderful 4-day week world are the kind of blue-collar workers who are also the ones that have the shortest healthy life expectancies, and often now already the state pension age is kind of coinciding with the point at which you're kind of not likely to live much longer in good health. And so I think there could still be some inequalities in that vision.
You wanted to comment?
I just think it's weird that we think we have to redistribute our leisure rather than just have more of it. Why can't we just have more leisure? You know, we're meant to be more productive. Obviously, that leisure doesn't have to be watching Netflix, although nothing wrong with watching Netflix in my book. Very nice activity. But I don't see why we can't be more ambitious and say we're meant to have got richer as a society. We're apparently getting these amazing productivity gains. Human ingenuity has delivered us this huge technical advance. Why can't we have that back in some leisure? That would be my call.
Yeah. I also just quickly want to comment before I think we take one last question around the question of like young people and that organizations or ideally the society as a whole would agree on some form of work reduction if we want that. Because there's something around career progression and that young people, especially in the beginning of their career, still want to signal that I'm here, I can work hard, I can work long hours. We have some anecdotal evidence that young employees might send emails late at night just to signal, I'm still working, right? You can rely on me, I'm a hardworking individual. So it almost seems like a mindset shift that needs to go on. And if the mindset shift is just in myself, it might be a huge disadvantage in terms of my career progression, potentially.
I think as Kate said, culture is, and as you're saying, culture is important, the way we signal. And for a long time now, in the UK, we've had this idea that, yeah, hard work is a way of signalling that you're a good employee. That's changing. In some of the 4-day week organisations we've looked at, I've seen exactly the opposite. People saying if you're really good at your job, if you're on your game, you can do the job in 4 days. The people who need 5 days to do the job, because they're not as good as me. So it's the reverse of that. I'm not saying that's any better, but yeah, we need to get away from that culture, and I think we are, hopefully, moving in that direction.
Okay. Happy to take a question. The lady here with the green scarf.
Hi, Anna Kime, Centre for Cultural Value, and I appreciate this might be beyond the scope of the panel, but I'm curious. My 8-year-old frequently makes the argument he should have at least a 3-day weekend. Is he right? And if so, what could the consequences of a reduced school week be?
It's beyond my competence. Certainly, one of the larger organisations we've had in the UK trial was a school. It was actually a special school, and they did successfully go to a 4-day week for the teachers and the other school staff, but the pupils still worked for 5 days a week. And again, first of all, they said, we can't do it. And then they realised you don't have to teach maths on a Monday, you don't have to teach English on a Tuesday. They had to reconfigure, again, look at where they were using it, staff inefficiently. In fact, for the teachers, it meant they didn't have to prepare their lessons on a Saturday morning, they could do it on a Tuesday morning. But yeah, what happens to pupils in those, I'm not an educationalist, I've heard some of my colleagues say you can't get through the national curriculum in 4 days a week. I don't know. You hear people talking, well, if kids can go off to museums and do all sorts of exploring on their other day. I don't. Your guess is, maybe you've got some educationalists in the audience who can answer that question. I don't know. Okay.
One final question, I think, from the audience before we wrap up. Yeah, who's quicker?
Hi, I'm Patrick Towell from the Audience Agency. think it's not about the 4-day week, so that should be a good change. So I think it's about either innovation as a contribution to productivity or meaningfulness in the work. And so because in my work I'm looking at creative industries and culture, just thinking about those things that humans can do that machines can't. So just reflections from you on creativity as a thing that's uniquely human, and also kind of emotional intelligence and our ability to empathise both with customers and colleagues.
Yeah. Sarah?
So about 5 years ago, or maybe more, I was asked to write a piece for like a supplement at the FT, which was, the question was like, it was a piece addressed to parents. It was like, how should you help your kids to sort of robot-proof their future? And I sort of wrote, well, obviously the things that machines won't be able to do are empathy, creativity, critical thinking, blah, blah, blah. But lo and behold, in fact, creative jobs have been among the first ones to start to feel the effects of AI. And that's, that's not me saying that I think machines can match human creativity, but I do think that actually the idea that those skills are kind of going to be immune from the kind of technological revolution that's coming, I think is sadly not true. And I think that's a shame because, a lot of people do find meaning and joy and pleasure from creative jobs. I don't think we'll ever stop being creative, but I think there are a kind of a range of creative jobs that are beginning to be affected already. And whether that is, the job disappearing or whether it just changes the way you have to do that job. But I'm writing a book at the minute on sort of work and technological change, and I'm trying to interview people who are like on the front lines of some of this stuff. And some of the sort of creative people that I've spoken to, they're now basically being given a kind of an AI first draft of something, and they're told, your job now is to sort of refine it and make it a bit better. And actually they're saying, this is not what I want. This is not joyful. This is not creative. You're kind of removing the bit of it that I like. So sorry, that's a slightly gloomy answer to your question, but yeah, I fear that the creative sector is going to be in the eye of the storm in the next few years.
Okay.
I think there's something really interesting about the human contact point and kind of basically what people are prepared to pay for. So if you go to a less expensive hotel now, you will probably have a self-check-in. If you go to a more expensive hotel, you'll probably have someone who greets you and takes your bag and says, how was your journey here? And I think there's something interesting about the fact that we do still value that kind of human connection, and people are very much prepared to pay for it. That, might tell us something about where we will have job growth, thinking about caring professions, for example, and where we might have less visible tasks being automated in the future.
Great. I think it's almost time to wrap up this session. I think for me and hopefully also for the audience would be interesting to hear if we have the same conversation in, let's say, 10 years' time. I think I already know Brendan's answer here, but what is the single change in the world of work that you would hope has become a reality?
Wow, okay. I would like it if we have collectively, through some combination of better collective bargaining and better laws and enforcement of those laws, just do away with jobs that are bad for people. Like, as I said at the start, I think it's hard to define what a good job is, but it's easy to define what is bad in work. And, do no harm is a great place to start. So, jobs where you're constantly surveilled, jobs where you have no control over decisions that are made, particularly around the introduction of new technology, jobs where the productivity, the gains of any productivity gains are kind of absorbed by the firm and you don't get any share of them. It'd be great, I think, in 10 years' time if we figured out collectively a way to do away with work that's bad for us.
Brendan?
As well as working short hours, I would like to see, and job quality, I totally agree. I would like to see a country, world, where many more people are involved in the labour market, even if they're only working 1 day a week. Again, this is based on the evidence that we collect. Those large number of people who are currently unemployed, and economically inactive. Even if they were in paid employment 1 day a week, it would be a huge benefit to their own mental health, as long as they're good jobs. I mean, there are some jobs where you're better off not working because they're such bad jobs. Fortunately, in the UK, they're a minority. Yeah.
Well, I'll give my professional, which is also obviously my personal answer, which is there will be more people in trade unions, and that's because we know it is the most effective way to drive up work. But I hope if we were having this conversation, we'd be saying, we found out we can make work better. How can we make it even better still, rather than debating whether that's possible at all?
Yeah, great. So I think we can kind of conclude that it's hard to understand what is a good job, what is meaningful is depending very much on the individual, but there's certain characteristics of bad job that we just want to erase, and that most jobs or being in employment most of the time is good for individuals and hopefully also for businesses and society. Great. With this, I would like to end this session. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. So thank you, Sarah, Brendan, and Kate. And we meet here again in 30 minutes for our fourth panel, where we talk about forgotten about places. So thank you all.